I say in the book that nobody has failed up more spectacularly than Donald, and nobody is less worthy of it.
Yeah.
He has no skills outside of, he's pretty good at recognizing a mark, and he's pretty good at taking advantage of people who are weaker than he is. But he has no business skills. He has no um, emotional intelligence. He has no intellectual curiosity. And we can go on all day, but
Yeah.
it's devastating to me because it undermines, it diminishes um, whatever American idealism there used to be.
Hello, and welcome to Erich McElroy's American Exchange. With today, we're going into the archives back to our very first series of podcasts, and for the first time ever put on YouTube, our full conversation with Mary Trump. We had this right before the election in 2020, right when Biden was on course to win the election, according to some people. Not her uncle, apparently. So it's an interesting look back to see where we were at almost exactly 4 years ago at this time. Of course, now we're post a Trump victory over the Democrats. We talk about the upcoming election. We talk about her family and her book, Too Much and Never Enough, which is a fantastic look at the dynamics and the psychology of what makes Trump Trump. So these things are all still true. Basically, Trump is now everybody's daddy, and we are all in this dysfunctional house together. We talk about her relationship with him. We talk about her view on the kids and how corrupt it was that they were in the White House and still will be going forward, and seeing what happens with the family and the other people that get put into place. Um, an interesting conversation about how to know when Trump is lying as well. So it's still very timely, even 4 years later. It's an incredible insight into the mind of the man who will become president again shortly. Oh, and as you're watching this on YouTube, this is a fantastic time to subscribe to the channel, share the video if you like it, and yeah, enjoy. And we'll be back with new episodes in January. Well, thank you for joining us today. This is a big question for you. I'm going to start with Mary. This is a heavy one. How do I convince my mother not to vote for your uncle? Because she very may well do so.
I guess I need to counter with a question first. Is
Okay.
she right now
Mm.
planning? Does she still support him? And is she most likely going to vote for him?
Well, she's in Washington State, so we're a little bit safe with her vote.
Yeah.
But I think, and I've heard you talk about this before, that we'd like to see your uncle lose by a landslide. So
Yeah.
every vote in every state makes a difference.
Yes.
I With my mom, I can't. I mean, I became a stand-up partly because of my mother, so I can't tell if she's just trying to wind me up, if
Yeah.
she might not vote at all. She's very much of the school of, well, they're both a bit, dodgy. Biden's been around a long time, giving it that's kind of that
Yeah.
equivalency thing that they did with Hillary. She's a little bit playing that card, but yeah, I think what would you say on that kind of person to person?
I think the difference between now and 4 years ago is he actually has a track record.
Mm,
I mean, he did before, but apparently only people inside of New York understood that. So thanks to Mark Burnett. But this is really different. He has committed atrocities now.
yeah,
He has taken children away from their parents and incarcerated them at the border, and is failing to return over 500 of them to their families.
yeah,
He has willfully mismanaged a crisis that is resulting in American deaths every day. And not only that, we are getting worse, exponentially worse. We've had more cases in the last week than we've had since the beginning, which suggests not only that this administration has learned nothing, but that it literally doesn't care if Americans keep getting sick and dying. So, if that's not enough, I mean, sure, there are things we can point to about Joe Biden's career. Um, but I think those are irrelevant because Joe Biden was a senator and a vice president. He was never in charge of anything,
mm,
with the possible exception of the Clarence Thomas hearing,
yeah.
which admittedly he did not handle well. But that was like 30 years ago.
Mhm.
We're living in the present. We're living with an administration that is dismantling every institution in this country and continually putting people in danger. If that's not enough, I honestly, what, when people ask me this question, and just in terms of voters in general, I say don't waste your time. Focus on people who are undecided about whether or not they want to vote at all.
Yeah.
But people who are right now, if there's not enough information to convince them, then nothing you say is going to matter. And hopefully, your mother is just winding you up and is going to do the right thing. But, I just, part of it too is just self preservation. Like, how do you continue to bang your head against that wall? It must be devastating on some level.
Yeah. I, I mean, I think, well, with Trump and the people, I mean, you talk about COVID and the fact that people are getting sick and they just don't care. It's interesting because you talk a lot in your book about how, this stems from your grandfather, Trump's father, not allowing illness in the family because illness equaled weakness.
Right.
And how that philosophy coming from Trump as president has essentially infected the administration of the White House.
Yeah.
That's astounding.
Well, think about what just happened yesterday. Let's leave aside for a moment the utter disgrace of Amy Coney Barrett and the Senate Judiciary run by Republicans and Mitch McConnell in rushing through that nomination in 30 days when in 194 they haven't bothered to deal with getting us a COVID relief bill. Let's
Yeah.
leave that aside for a second. After we now know that her nomination party or whatever it was at the White House was a super spreader event.
Hmm.
They did the same thing yesterday. Not one of them was wearing a mask. There was
Yeah.
no social distancing. And it makes you wonder because it's one thing. I mean, I get why Donald's doing it. But it's one thing for his surrogates and people in his administration not to care about other people. This does not surprise me. But they're always actively putting themselves, their children, their parents, their spouses at risk. They may not care about the Uber driver or the waiter or the housekeeper or, whomever, whatever random, unimportant to them people they come into contact with. But what about their children? I mean, my cousin,
Hmm.
Barron, got it.
Yeah.
And so it's not like they're exempt in any way. That's the part that continues to mystify me.
But I have heard people, I mean, talking about Trump's approach to this, say, not reputable people, but there's a moment with him because he lies so much.
Mhm.
People saying that he faked the COVID. But then again, looking at how your family traditionally views illness, that doesn't seem to me like a strategy he would have chosen. Like, there's no
It's
way he did make it up.
it's extraordinarily unlikely. I mean, I'm not going to say it's impossible because who knows.
Yeah.
I think there is a small possibility that somebody in his inner circle convinced him it would be worth taking the small hit by admitting he was weak if he came out
Mm.
and ripped off his shirt to show his Superman t-shirt underneath. Sorry, I wish they had allowed him to do that.
Yeah.
But given the psychology, I think admitting weakness, that kind of weakness, is characterologically improbable to say the least. And the other thing too, I have asthma. I
Mm.
know what it looks like when you're having trouble breathing. And when he came back to the White House from Walter Reed and took off his mask and continued to infect everybody around him, he was having trouble breathing.
Yeah.
So,
When he came up and he walked up the stairs and he
and he
managed to
did
get up
his
to the top of the
Evita
stairs and
moment. Yeah.
yeah, and that kind of thing, which they kind of recreated yesterday, which is a bizarre. So because there's some UK people listening as well. So Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the Supreme Court in record time to essentially replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The Senate, rushed through her nomination after holding up one of Obama's nomination, and so they put her on the court, which is a lifetime appointment, and you can argue that she's not very well qualified because she's barely been a trial lawyer, she's barely been a judge. Um, but Trump has taken a lot of credit for having his 3 seats on the court, but really, he didn't do it. It was Mitch McConnell who did this. But that for him, it becomes a Trump victory.
Well, he's going to take credit for anything he can take credit for, and let's be real. There's very little he can take credit for that even people on his side of the aisle would consider good, like, withdrawing from the Paris Accord or the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal. I'm not entirely sure why anybody thinks those were good ideas, but people on the right do in this
Mm.
country. So yeah, he will always take credit for anything. And it is weird because, I mean, Mitch McConnell can take credit for the fact that this was allowed to happen because he violated every single norm uh, in the Constitution. He, in my view, Mitch
Mm.
McConnell is the greatest traitor to this country since Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
So the vacancies are vacancies. Like it's like Donald is suggesting you need to be a brain surgeon in order to fill vacancies,
Yeah.
which is weird enough. But on the other hand, there are hundreds of vacancies that his administration has failed to fill.
Mm.
So he
But,
yeah.
and that's what's fascinating, looking at your book, which is that basically this is the same formula that has propped up Donald all of his life, that his father was the person underpinning his success in New York,
Right.
and that the TV producer was the person behind his success with The Apprentice, and that
Mhm.
he has just managed to fall into these victories with almost no skill or actual, intelligence or anything. How do you get that kind of luck?
You get born the second son of Fred C. Trump,
Yeah.
basically. um it's astonishing. And actually, when I started writing the book, I my initial goal was to help people understand the developmental history of my family,
Mm.
um from my personal and my perspective as a clinical psychologist. But um, as I started looking into what happened in the early years, I recognized all of these through lines, which remain essentially unbroken from Donald's being propped up by his father to Donald's being propped up by the Republican Party. And it just blew me away how many there were and
Mm.
how consistent it was. So it went from my grandfather to the New York media to the banks to Mark Burnett
Yeah.
and presumably from Russia, and then the Republican Party. And it's I say in the book that nobody has failed up more spectacularly than Donald, and nobody is less worthy of it.
Yeah.
He has no skills outside of, he's pretty good at recognizing a mark, and he's pretty good at taking advantage of people who are weaker than he is. But he has no business skills. He has no um, emotional intelligence. He has no intellectual curiosity. We can go on all day, but
Yeah.
it's devastating to me because it undermines, it diminishes um, whatever American idealism there used to be.
Yeah, which I think is, having lived outside of the US and looking back all this time, 20 years of trying to translate American optimism and the sense of the American dream to British people who, I don't know how much time you spend in Britain, but they can be very cynical about all of those kinds of things and
Yeah.
don't have that kind of, they struggle with the national pride and everything else. It hasn't been until this presidency that I've seen that not be true, and I'm coming from, obviously a straight white male perspective in that and those advantages that are built into
Yeah.
that that but I still think that there's been a hope in America that resonates and does give opportunity. And for the first time ever, I've seen, especially with what's happened with this new appointment of this woman up to the Supreme Court and the desperate attempts to influence the election, because I don't think there's any chance that he will win the popular vote. I think that's off the table, and then it's just whether the Electoral College comes through again. Um, and then and I've seen you already talk about, what happens if he loses. That the best thing would be a massive, um, uh, landslide in Joe Biden's favor. I mean, if he goes, and then eventually goes peacefully, and once they tear him out of the White House or whatever, I mean, maybe if they just give him a set of the towels. I think if they give him a set of the towels and a few other,
Silverware.
keepsakes, yeah, the
Silverware,
silverware,
probably.
everyone else he'll leave behind except maybe Ivanka. He'll take Ivanka, the towels. Is there anything else you think he would be?
You know, the silver it's stuff that like has his name on it
Oh
with
yeah, of course. Yeah,
45, you know, all of the embroidered clothing.
anything like that.
They
And then we'll find it on sale on eBay in a few weeks' time to pay for wherever they end up.
totally.
Uh, I mean, but I mean, the narrative that he's built around him. I mean, does he because like you talked the story about when you met Melania and he told her that you'd had a drug problem and you're like you could tell it, you could see the twinkle in his eye that he knows he's just trying to maybe wind you up a bit
Yeah.
and creating a fictitious story to make it more dramatically exciting.
Mhm.
But do you think that now his reality is so distorted he wouldn't know whether or not you had that drug problem or whether or not Mexico is paying for the wall? Because I think for him, when you lie at that level, it all just blurs together, doesn't it?
It does indeed. And in fact, Donald may be the only person on the planet who can actually gaslight himself. You know, because think
It's
about this.
brilliant.
The first time he says something, see, the
Mm,
first time he lies, you can tell when he knows.
yeah,
Like when he said that about my drug problem, he's like, you know, and he was waiting to see, and he does this with other people. He waits to see if you're going to let the lies stand, which
yeah,
then means he owns you, right? Um, the next time he says it, it kind of becomes part of his narrative. And it doesn't happen right away, but over time, he actually does come to believe what
mm,
he's saying, which is why it has some authority with people who are willing to be taken in by it.
yeah,
So, you know, why does he start to believe his own lies? Because he's always had to, because he knows on a very deep level that beneath it all he's just a terrified little boy who's absolutely nothing he claims to be.
yeah.
And you know, he needs to expend an awful lot of energy keeping other people from finding that out, including himself.
Is there anyone, do you think, who can have real talk with him, like Ivanka or Melania or some other figure? Or would that have to be a male figure because of his views towards women, which are so horrific?
Well, you're suggesting that Ivanka or Melania would be interested in having a real conversation. You know, these are two people who know very well which side their bread is buttered. Um, so no, because first of all, nobody in his inner circle would dare because they're all using him.
Yeah,
Um, you know, maybe with the exception of like a true believer like Mark Meadows, who is clearly a moron. But you know, sorry, was that too
that's unfair
subtle?
to morons, but yeah, we'll let that
I
slide.
know.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sorry, morons. Um, but you know, people like Ivanka, Jared, Melania, they're benefiting so enormously from Donald's position that they're not going to risk it because they also know that their relationships with him are not just transactional, they're conditional.
hmm,
And we've seen this. How many people who haven't sufficiently towed the line for Donald um, are gone?
yeah,
And his kids know that. His kids are very, very well aware of it, and because that's exactly what Donald's childhood was like. You know, his relationship with his father and his siblings' relationship with their father was similar,
hmm,
transactional and conditional.
yeah. Um, do you think? Well, this is we're talking about the children. Their portrayal on things like Saturday Night Live and late night and stuff has had Eric Trump being the kind of the dumbest of the lot. Would you agree with that characterization? Having
I think it's Donnie, but on the other hand, I so entirely resent that these are people who need to be spoken about because, and they do need to be spoken about because Ivanka, uh, which is and particularly Jared, have positions of power
yeah,
in our government, which is another stain upon our country's reputation because that should never be allowed to happen. And you know, Donnie and Eric, um, well, not Eric so much, but Donnie is being actively discussed in. This is so horrifying. Actively discussed in
yeah,
certain Republican circles as a potential candidate.
which
Oh,
is
Britain, I'm
yeah.
so sorry.
Oh, we got our problems over here. Boris
uh,
Johnson and Brexit. I want to. You don't
I
even
know,
want to
I know.
know. You don't
That's
even
right.
want
You
to
guys
know.
can't throw any stones, but
Yeah,
still, that's just it's both. absurd and horrifying.
Yeah.
So the fact that these people have been elevated, the fact like people like Stephen Miller have been elevated, Stephen Miller, the Nazi, who's actively engaged in torturing children at the border, that they shouldn't be allowed in polite society,
Yeah.
let alone being allowed anywhere near the levers of power. So um anyway, though, I do think Donnie is definitely the least intelligent of them. I mean, Eric's maybe a close second, but yeah, they're both kind of useless.
Assuming, and I don't want to jinx any soon, but so when the fall comes, it, maybe it's only a week, but keep voting. Assuming the fall comes, how long till Ivanka and Jared just flip and say we were just there trying to hold back the tide of horribleness, and that try and regain their circle of, because I mean, the Hillarys used to hang out with the Clintons used to hang out with the Trumps. They were in with the intelligentsia of New York and all that kind of stuff. It's just a matter of time before they try and say, oh, it wasn't us.
Yeah, I don't know if they were in necessarily. It's just a thing that rich people do. Like they
Yeah.
always gather in the same places. Um, so it's more that they, I don't know, they're kind of like their father. They kind of bought their way in. And to be fair, the Kushners have a lot of money and, we're, I think, more connected than
Mm.
Donald and his kids in that realm. What I'm seeing already, though, is that Jared is kind of laying the foundation for a move to a Trump TV network.
Right. That was one of
Which,
the things I was going to ask you is what.
yeah,
So yeah, if the fall comes, what do they do next?
right. So in you can see that in two ways. One, they're hedging their bets,
Yeah.
and two, it's a way to soften the blow for Donald. If he loses, it gives him something else to focus on. I
Mm.
don't know that you can run a TV network from prison, but I guess we're gonna find out. So Ivanka and Jared will indeed try to make that pivot.
Mm.
However, we New Yorkers are not having it.
Yeah.
They will never be allowed back into New York City again. Um, they have disgraced this country. They have been, in my view, um, traitors.
Mm.
They support a traitor. They've done absolutely nothing to mitigate the damage that Donald has inflicted. In fact, certainly in Jared's case, he's helped.
Yeah.
So we need to hold people accountable. And part of that process is making sure they are not allowed to gaslight us into thinking that they were really trying hard to make things better because it's an absolute lie.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the thing is, I think there was a moment where Trump, after he, did become president, where he could have become more dangerous from an electability standard than he became. And that is if, because he has no grounding of his own beliefs other than, Trump for Trump, if
Right.
he had, if he reached out to the Democrats and really worked on a Democrat-led infrastructure bill, Democrat-led Dreamers Act, because he would have been done with the Republicans then and tossed them aside.
Mhm.
And then because Democrats are desperate to govern, and that's their weakness, is that they will actually try and do
How
something.
dare they?
How dare they? They would have been suckered in, like they did some deals with George W. Bush and so on.
I know.
That would have made him actually, very difficult to defeat. But I guess because of the sycophants around him and because of people like Stephen Miller, because he's just sort of absorbing what's presented to him, because there's no agenda beyond what's good for him.
Well, yeah, but it's driven by his psychopathologies because
Mm.
what he thinks is good for him is also sometimes incredibly self-defeating.
Yeah.
Like, what would have been more effective than having a an intelligent, well deployed COVID-19 strategy? If he had put in place a federal response at the very beginning, people who hate his guts would have forgiven him for everything else. Well,
Yeah.
maybe not everything, but you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Um, he can't do that. He thrives in division and chaos. he likes stirring up other people's hatred and rage.
Mm.
So it's just impossible. Like the fact that he can't recognize that he could have been a hero here just shows you how far gone he is.
Yeah.
And people around him know that. And some people are just too afraid to say anything. And some people like Stephen Miller also like it because, you know, he's evil. He really gets off on torturing small brown children. I mean, seriously, like we can't like pull any
Yeah.
punches. Like that's what these people are doing. And that's what they seem to be motivated by.
Which is terrifying at the highest levels of the U.S. government. I realize we're kind of taking up the time that I promised to take from you, so I don't want to keep you from other things because I'm sure you're busy.
I have another thing, but yeah, good. We can
So
wrap.
I've got one more question. I want to say I loved your book. Too much is never enough. The other thing I could relate to it, but you know, the election's more important to talk about now, is just having come from an abusive family figure for the patriarch like that. I was like, oh yeah, I see what this is. I see this.
Yeah.
So I saw a lot of that, and I think making that personal has, I would imagine, has touched a lot of people. So I really appreciate that you wrote the book, and I think it was important, and I'm glad that you came out, and I'm sure you're glad that you got to come out and say this, because you know it's helped a lot of people, I'm sure. But the last question I wanted to ask you is that you know, a lot of people have done impressions of Donald Trump. Do you have a Donald Trump impression?
Oh my God. No, only when my eyebrows grow out. And you cannot deny the relationship, unfortunately. But it's just my eyebrows. That's
Right.
it.
It's all, eyebrows are very important for a guy. I mean, yeah.
True. But
I've
also,
tried, yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I said I've denied his legitimacy as president by never doing one. I've refused. So,
and I can't. It's weird. I grew up at the next town over in Queens, and I cannot do a Queens accent. It's very. I guess it's good.
that's good. It's probably for the best. You don't want to be doing that. So,
exactly.
yeah. So there we go. That was a look back on our conversation with Mary Trump from 2020, right before Donald Trump lost the election. Remember those good times when Trump would lose an election? It's fascinating to see how she dissects the way that Trump lies, the way he brings people into his lies, and the way that people then get sucked into supporting them. And maybe he even believes that they're true. So it's fascinating to talk to her back then. It's great to look back on it now. So I'm still very, very thankful that she did the podcast back then. If you've enjoyed this, check out our other episodes. There's loads more that are just up until the last month or so, and we'll be back soon with brand new episodes. So thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.